Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, I am doing an episode that wasn't planned, but the reason why I decided to do it is because, as a lot of you might have seen, there is actually a lot of talk at the moment around free birth and the price of free birth as per the written piece that has been released by the ABC and written by Charlotte King, and which is also an audio piece that you can listen to. So I've seen that obviously that's going around and around, and there's also the episode that the Great Birth Rebellion has done where Melanie the midwife is chatting with Charlotte King, and they're basically debriefing where the episode has come from and where it went and so on. And so I'm not with this. I'm not trying to jump on a trend or be like on the polls and I'm going to talk about this. But rather, what I want to do is I just want to add to the conversation and just instead of being like, I don't want to be, this episode is by no means pro or against free birth. On the podcast, I support absolutely every type of birth. I do not censor any types of birth. So on my podcast, I do have women that come and talk about their birth, regardless of where and how they birth. So on my podcast, you'll freely find hospital births, you'll find C-sections, you'll find home birth transfers, and free births. To me, that's a reflection of the variety of birth that exists in Australia amongst women. And for some of them, the free birth decision was a choice, and for others, it wasn't. So let's just say that right now, I'm not with this episode, I'm not trying to be pro or against. I just want to add a bit more to the discussion because I think the piece that Charlotte King wrote, I think it genuinely came from a place of wanting to investigate something she claimed she didn't know about, and that's fair enough. But I think the angle that it took is what I want to say is like mainstream media just like pointing the finger at someone. And so with this episode, what I want to do is I just want to add a bit more meat to the discussion, and I just want to maybe nuance a bit what hasn't been talked about, in my opinion, in that ABC piece. So for those who don't know, for those who haven't seen anything about it, the ABC did a really long journalistic work around birthing practices, and initially their intention wasn't to talk about free birth, but while they asked for feedback for women to talk about their birth experience, and from there was a lot of talk about free birthing. And so that's how supposedly the ABC started to go down the rabbit hole of what is a free birth and what does it involve. And then from there, they went down the rabbit hole of the risks, the death that have occurred, both neonatal death, but also maternal death. And then obviously their angle to me is that free birth isn't safe and it's on the rise, and doulas are advertising free birth as an empowering, beautiful, magical experience, and they're advertising for their services to support this type of birth, and then women are just leaning into it type thing, which to me, I mean, that's my take on the angle, obviously. To me, that's really wrong, because obviously when a woman chooses to free birth, she's not influenced by like influencers on Instagram, or she's not thinking, oh, I'm going to have a free birth because I've seen this magical birth video on Instagram or on TikTok, and I'm going to have one and I'm going to film it and then I'm going to go viral. Like, that's not the point at all to me. So I'll try and be as I'll try and have some structure to this, but because it's like a conversational piece, it's kind of like I'll obviously everything in this is my own opinion. So I'll try and make it so it's got a direction, let's say. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, to me, free birth is not on the rise. To me, free birth has always existed, as we know, but when mainstream media talks about it's on the rise, to me, that's not true. To me, what it's saying is that we see more of it now, and that's mostly due to the fact that there is a lot more social medias available. There is a lot more ways to share about your birth. So now you can, you can find birthing videos on YouTube. You can share about your birth on Instagram, on Facebook, on TikTok, on podcasts. You've got a lot more birthing podcasts. It is spoken a lot more these days. It is a lot less taboo. It still is taboo. There is still this layer of taboo for sure. It's still taboo to a degree, but it's more spoken about. And I think there's also this idea that women want to help women. So by sharing their experience, they really want to show women that there are other options available. Whether they take those options or not are the woman's choices. That's what they want to do. That's what they decide to do. To me, there is no pressure from anyone to have a free birth or to not have a free birth, but it's about showing them the options. In that sense, what I want to say is if we look at stats, if we look at hard evidence that has been released from the Australian government, right? So we're talking about, if we look at the Australian Mothers and Babies report that was released, the latest one was released in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And if we look at that, it actually tells us pretty much everything we need to know about birthing in Australia. The only thing it's not telling us about free birth. For the only reason that the way those stats are collected, they're collected when you birth in a hospital, whether that's a public or a private hospital. And so when you don't birth in a hospital or you don't go to hospital or have to birth, they actually can't record those. And also, I think a lot of free birth is not recorded because there is also some data that's recorded when you register the birth of your baby. So it's collected by the registry of marriage, birth and death of your state. And if you don't register your baby's birth, they actually can't record those data either. So hence they call it, there's a big black hole because there is no data collected. So I find it quite interesting when the ABC is talking about there's been, 7 babies' death in 2022. But what's not being talked about is, okay, there's been 7 baby death. That's extremely sad, of course. But compared to how many live birth, what are we comparing against? Because if we look at the Mothers and Babies report, the rates of stillbirth in Australia in 2021 are 7.2 per 1,000 birth. So, I mean, that's a lot. That's a rate that's actually been going up when you compare it. I went on the Australian Mothers and Babies report, and when they compared the 2021 stillbirth rate to the 2011, so 10 years before, it was actually 6.7. So the stillbirth rate has been going up. Again, I come from a scientific background, so I look at that and I go, okay, well, that's an increase. But again, are we also seeing that there has been an increase in the number of birth? And so therefore, with an increase in the number of birth, well, you'd have an increase in the number of stillbirths as well. So, I mean, you've got to nuance those stats, I feel. And so to me, when the ABC says, well, there's been 7 baby deaths, yes, but how many live births? They don't know. No one knows, right? Because as they said, there is actually no data being reported. So I think, what we need to see is death happens in a hospital setting as well. There are stillbirths, there are neonatal deaths that occur either during delivery, in the hours after delivery, or, in the days after. That happens in a hospital setting too. So, it's not, it's not about pointing the finger, but it's about saying, well, let's nuance this and let's consider that. So now I think, to me, what this piece, and I know they probably, couldn't talk about everything like I'm doing now because, well, that would be a very, 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 very long piece. But I mean, to me, it's important to add some nuance to it. And I know I'm saying nuanced a lot. Sorry about that. So to me, the reason why women choose to free birth, and I have spoken to a lot of women. I have spoken to women from very different background. They lived in many different places in Australia. Some are rural, some are remote, some are, living in suburbia and so on. And to me, the reason why free birth, it's not on the rise, but the reason why free birth is more considered as an option these days is actually more to do with the fact that women feel really let down by the hospital system. We know that 98% of women birth in the hospital system. And so, therefore, if you think about it, well, you've only got, 2% that are birthing outside of that, which includes home births, and it includes the ones where they didn't make it to hospital, like me, basically. Why are women feeling let down by the system? I think that is a very interesting thing to talk about. So, what I've heard, and if you haven't seen it at the moment, it's March when I record this. At the moment, every day in March, I am releasing a woman's birth story that that have been submitted to me, and I'm rewriting them, and I'm turning it into an Instagram and Facebook post to highlight the strength and the resilience of women, because on the 8th of March, it's International Women's Day. And when I received those submissions, what really struck me is the system failing a lot of women. So a lot of those stories that you will see in March, if you haven't seen it, go on my socials. You can find me at Kapa with Adula on Instagram and Kapa with Adula on Facebook. If you haven't seen it, go and read some of those. Some are absolutely beautiful, empowering, they're great. And others are, I want to say, a window into what the hospital system is like for some women. We're talking about women that have birthed in hospitals where there was no adequate staff. Either there was not enough staff available, or there was no professionally maternal, no professional trained in birth available to them, whether it was because of the time they birthed at or whether it was because of rural and remoteness. But again, women have a right to have access to adequate maternal care, and they're not getting it. And when they are, the system is failing these women, because I, to do this chat, I went back to look at the Australian Mother and Babies report, and something that was absolutely shocking to me was when I looked at the rates of induction of labor. Right, so in 2021, there was 34% of women that had the labor induced, and the main reasons they're listing for the induction of labor was diabetes, pre-labor rupture of membranes, and prolonged pregnancy. The last two, to me, are absolutely shocking. So we know from stats that, yes, your labor can start with your membranes rupturing, so basically your water's releasing, and we know that sometimes contractions don't begin straight away. But for the majority, we know that that can happen within 48 hours on its own. Yet when women have their waters released, and let's say they call the hospital, they let the midwives know, all of a sudden, and sometimes a lot of them don't know that, but all of a sudden you put on a clock, and so all of a sudden the hospital is looking at the time at which you reported that your waters had released, and then in their head they're going, okay, well, we're not going to let her have her waters released for more than X hours. And I know the hospital is trying to prevent risks of, for example, infection. But in saying that, they're doing that while also checking the dilation of the woman every so often, which is also counterintuitive, because the more often you introduce a finger to check dilation, the more often you are likely to introduce bacteria that could cause an infection. So that also doesn't make sense. So there's those things like that where it doesn't make sense. And the very last reason for inducing labor, prolonged pregnancy, that's not even defined. I went to look at, well, what's prolonged pregnancy? And again, we're talking about probably a pregnancy that has passed its due date, which we know the due date is a date that was calculated back in the 1800s by a German dude who probably just decided that due date was the thing. But maybe back then there was some evidence about it, but we know now that a due date is actually not likely to predict when you're going into labor. You can give birth anywhere from 37 to 42 weeks. That is 5 weeks in itself. So, that's a lot of guessing. And they, even when I was a first time mom, I was even told that it was very unlikely for me to give birth before 40 weeks. So why are we inducing labor for prolonged pregnancy? What is that? And then the other stat that I thought was really interesting was amongst first time moms, 39% of them had an augmentation of labor compared to only 20% of moms who were who were having subsequent labors. So I think this is a really good insight into why the hospital system is failing women. And I think what it is really showing us is that, and this is something I've heard in my podcast too, women go to hospital to give birth because they feel that's the safest place. They feel they will have access to professional, they will have access to a theater if they need to, they will have access to instruments, forceps, vacuum, episiotomy, C-section if needed. True. And they also say they feel like, and that's usually before their birth, they feel like, well, the hospital has my best interest at heart. The hospital is really trying to help me for sure. But then they have their birth and then they go, well, actually, the hospital didn't have my best interest at heart. The hospital had its best interest at heart. And this is exactly what, to me, those stats are showing. The stats are showing me that the hospitals have policies. They have policies, they have procedures. And so probably the reason for this increase in the induction of labor, this increase in the augmentation of labor is probably due to some policies that, that we as women are not told. We're not told about those unless we actually ask. And even then, sometimes you're not even told. But you can actually type, and I just did it just now, Queensland Health, for example, if you're birthing in Queensland Health maternity guidelines. And honestly, it's a really long document, but it's actually really interesting to read because this is what most hospital in Queensland, for example, are going to go by. And this actually highlights their guidelines, their policy, their procedures that's in that document, part of. And to me, what's really interesting with that is that if you read it, or if you read, the section about, for example, when do they start talking about induction of labor, or when do they start talking about, augmentation of labor and things like that, it actually really shows you that the hospital has its interest at heart. It's trying to remove any potential for being sued, any liabilities. It's trying to prevent death. That is true. And we know that, if we look back from, the 1800s, well, yes, we've definitely reduced drastically maternal and fetal death. That's true. But also, if, on the flip side, we are also creating more risks nowadays with the hospital policy and procedures, because what they're really trying to do is to bring down potential risks that exist down to zero pretty much, which is virtually impossible. And so they're trying to save women from potential risks, like, for example, the risk of GBS. So the risk of your baby potentially being exposed to group B strep during vaginal birth. They're trying to reduce that risk by testing women for GBS strain, which is, when you think about it, okay, makes sense. But then when they actually do it, the execution of it is, to me, it doesn't make sense, because they test at 36 weeks, which research shows that at 36 weeks you're less likely to actually show, if you do have GBS, you may be less likely to actually show it. And then just because you're negative at 36 weeks doesn't mean you can't be positive at 37 weeks. So if you consider that, then why are we only testing for GBS once? It almost sounds like you should be testing very regularly, yet you're only tested once. If you're negative, you're told you're negative, that's it. But if you're positive, then all of a sudden probably during your birth, you will be offered antibiotics. But during your birth, you may actually not be GBS positive anymore, but you're not tested for it because you were tested positive before. So to me, there's a lot of inconsistencies and things that don't make sense. I know they're trying to reduce risks, but also, to me, they're not doing it properly. So, and we've got evidence, we've got journal articles that actually show that. But for policies to change at, a health level, like, Queensland Health, New South Wales Health, and so on, it takes a long, long time. And so to me, they're sticking to guidelines that are outdated, that are just not up to date with the current research, and they're not up to date with what the current research is showing either. So it's really unfortunate that the hospitals go by guidelines trying to help women, trying to reduce risks, when they're actually creating them. Because, and we know that again from research, that if you go, let's say your waters break before labor, and then you don't have contractions, you're highly likely to be put on a clock and then be pretty much pushed to have an induction of your labor. So then they can say, okay, we need to get the baby out within 24 hours of your waters breaking. And if your contractions don't start naturally, we'll just induce you. We'll create contractions. Yes, but we know that, for example, with an induction, you're more likely to need pain relief because those contractions are not the same as natural uterine contractions that you get when your labor begins spontaneously. And with the use of analgesia, so we're talking about, the epidural, we're talking about potentially opioids like the morphine, we're talking about that, then comes a CTG monitoring. And then also, if you have an epidural, you're more likely to be bedridden, basically not being able to move from the bed. And that is not physiologically going to help you to birth your baby. So it's more likely that your baby's head might have trouble to come out, which means that if your baby's head is essentially stuck or has trouble to come out, you're more likely to require the use of forceps, vacuum, and maybe an episiotomy, which might lead to birth injuries. We're talking physical injuries, but we're also talking about emotional injuries of basically being told that you have to have those, and potentially not being heard when you say, well, that's not what I want. And also being, I've heard of, and I've had women tell me that they've had an episiotomy without it being asked. So that's no consent asked. So to me, at my little level of what I've heard and what I've read, and, those guidelines and so on, to me, there's a big nuance that needs to happen to say all of that, to come back to free birth and say, well, yes, women are free birthing, and yes, they're talking about it. To me, it's not that there is an increase in free birth, it's that we have more means of talking about it, we have more means of showing it. But the real article that needs to be done is about the failing of the hospital system. We need to talk about those rates of interventions that are above what the World Health Organization recommends for a country like Australia, where there is very high quality maternity care available, where there is trained midwives, trained obstetricians available, mostly, if we're not talking about remote and rural living, because that's completely different there. We also need to talk about the understaff, or the hospitals being understaffed, the staff being overworked. We need to talk about midwives that are just on shift for hours on end, and we know that if midwives are overworked, they're overrun, they're burnt out, they're more likely to make a mistake or make a misjudgment or not provide what to me is adequate care to women because of all of those. And I'm not trying to justify the shortfalls of the hospital. I'm trying again to add nuance and to say, well, that this topic that we're talking about today, free birth, it's actually a deeper cause that we need to talk about. It's not just women are free birthing. To me, that's scratching the surface. To me, if you go to a deeper level, what we need to be talking about is the failing of the system, the failing of the hospital system to provide a safe place for women, the failure of the hospital system to actually provide a place for women to birth in where they can be undisturbed, it can be hands off, and women can be respected, and they can have their birth choices, their birth preferences respected, where they're not told, oh, you want to birth in water? No, that's not going to happen because XYZ, whatever those reasons are. Or I've heard it myself. Actually, I can talk from experience. So when I was birthing this one that's with me today, in the weeks leading up to it, I said in the third stage, so when birthing the placenta, I do not want to have the syntocin, because if baby is fine and I'm fine, there is no rush for it. I will birth the placenta on my own term. And I was told that's not going to happen. We give the syntocin to everyone because we need the placenta out. I can tell you that was not going to fly with me. And, I went back, I looked at research, and it was, and basically what research was saying is there is actually no evidence that, pretty much as women give birth, giving them the syntocin to expel the placenta had benefits, unless there was actual red flags. So there was, for example, a postpartum hemorrhage, or there was an important blood loss, or baby or mom wasn't doing fine. Unless there was any of those flags, there was actually no evidence that this was actually clinically beneficial. So, I mean, that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about those midwives that have, and, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, I know if you've listened to the ABC episode and you've listened to the other episode, you've heard it of people saying, well, I'm not trying to point fingers at anyone, but I'm genuinely not trying to point fingers at anyone. But what I'm saying is, midwives in a hospital, they have to work under extremely strict guidelines. They have to follow protocols, which those protocols are not really friendly towards birthing women. And therefore, those midwives, they just don't have wiggle room. They have to obey to those protocols and those guidelines to keep their job. But those guidelines and protocols, they're not friendly towards women like me who are birthing in a hospital and wanting to have, an undisturbed birth, because if there is no emergency, well, there is no need for those, urgent interventions to happen, really. And what I thought was interesting too is, upon doing a little bit of research, I found out that back in the 1900s and the early 1900s, women were birthing at home. And now it's becoming more relevant these days as women are trying to birth at home more, because back then the hospital was only for sick people. You were going to hospital if you were sick. So if you were birthing, which is not a sickness, it's not an illness, it's not a disease, well, you didn't need to be in hospital. So you would have been a black sheep back then if you were birthing in a hospital. So therefore you were birthing at home, because that was the safest place to birth a baby. And so somewhere along the lines, we've evolved from we need to stay at home to birth to no, we need to birth in a hospital. This is the safest place. But now I think what's happening, what people are, calling it a revolution and so on, is that we're starting to question that. And we're starting to, as I'm doing today, we're looking at research, we're looking at the protocols, we're looking at things that we didn't have access to, 50 plus years ago. We didn't have access to all of that. And we're now questioning, because we have a lot more evidence in our hand, to go, well, hang on, the research says this, or, you've got this protocol, but it's not actually backed by evidence these days, because research has shown this. And so women are questioning more, and they're seeing that for them to achieve a birth that they want, such as, for example, an undisturbed birth where no one's touching them, they're not being told that they have to be induced, or they're not being put on a clock, or they're not being watched and being probed and being, checked for dilation and so on. Well, for them to achieve that, they basically try and remove themselves from the system. And another issue that I want to talk about removing yourself from the system and therefore not birthing in a hospital, is your other options, if you don't want to birth in a hospital, is to have a home birth or to have a free birth. Now, if we think about it, well, actually, there is a third option, which is a publicly funded home birth. That option is highly likely to be unavailable to a lot of women. One, because of the lack of funding. There is actually not a lot of publicly funded home birth programs available, and they are restricted to a very small radius. You could be out of the radius by about 300 meters and you would be out of the program. So those publicly funded home birth are great for those that can access them. They are very unlikely to be available for women that live outside of a bigger bigger city or bigger town. And we know that there's a lot of people that live more rurally, let's say, if we're not even talking about, remote living, we're talking about rural living. So living further away from, what I consider to be a bigger town or a bigger city. And so those programs are probably not available. And also we've seen that it's taken this long to finally have in Queensland on the Sunshine Coast a publicly funded home birth finally rolling out, again, only available on the Sunshine Coast, not for people living in Brisbane, north or south, and let alone not available for people living in, Rockhampton and Mackay and Cairns and so on, right? And so this program is actually, rolling out at the end of 2024. So, I mean, it's a very long time coming. And I think I read that the reason why they decided to enroll it at the Sunshine Coast was because they were seeing that on the Sunshine Coast, there is a rise of women not birthing in a hospital. Go figure, right? But so all of that to say, coming back to my point of your options available if you don't want to birth in a hospital. So a private midwife is your second option. So hiring a private midwife to have a home birth with a midwife is very, very, very costly. Yes, you do get some money back from Medicare, but you don't get money back for the actual birth. So in essence, depending on how much your private midwife charges, you get about a third back. And so therefore you're about 2/3 of, the total cost out of pocket, which for a lot of women, that's not achievable. And you can have a home birth with a private midwife if you have a private midwife within the area that you live. Again, we're coming back to this lack of services available theme where women might want to have a private midwife. Think about Brittany's episode that I just released, episode 31, where Brittany takes us through the fact that she wanted to have a private midwife, but she was living 10 hours away from Brisbane. There was no private midwife available in her area. And I know that she's not the only one. And I know that might sound like an extreme example because she was extremely rural. But a lot of women that live not that rural also don't have access to a private midwife. So therefore, for some women, their very last option, if they don't live close to a hospital, because some women actually don't live close to a hospital. The nearest hospital is 3 or 4 hours away. When you're in labor, how are you going to travel for 3 or 4 hours in labor in a car to get to hospital, to get checked up, or to give birth? That's totally ludicrous to sit in a car for 3 hours while in labor, hoping that you don't actually birth on the side of the road or in the car while it's in motion. Australia is such a big country that we have this lack of maternity services available because people live in very different places. So, the vast majority of people live around the coast. But as you get more inland, there is a lot less hospital with maternity services open. And I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it when I was traveling and I was pregnant with this one. And I wanted to get checked up for reduced fetal movement. And I went to, at the time, I wasn't actually that far. To me, I wasn't that rural. I was probably 2.5 hours from Newcastle. And so there was a hospital nearby me, 25 minutes. So I drove there to get checked up, to have a midwife listen to my baby's heart rate. And I was told, oh, no, we don't have a maternity. And I said, oh, okay, but do you have a midwife? Do you happen to have a midwife that, or someone that's trained in ultrasound that could listen to my baby's heart rate? And they said, oh, no, we don't do that. We used to have a maternity, but it's been closed for years. So now you have to drive. I had to drive another 40 minutes to get checked up. And I wasn't that rural. I was only 2.5 hours from Newcastle. That is an absolute disgrace on the public system to be closing its maternities in places that are, they are populated. I wasn't in a town with, 100 people living there. I was in a town where, I don't know, to me, there was a fair bit of people. And I wasn't that far from a major town being Newcastle. Yet, I had to drive all up. I had to drive almost an hour 20 just to get checked up. That was totally ludicrous, So I was thinking, well, like, that wasn't my birthing hospital. But if it had been, well, how was I meant to birth in a hospital an hour 20 away from me? That didn't make any sense to me. And so I think, to add to, again, to this nuanced conversation today is, well, what if we considered that women maybe are choosing to free birth because maybe they don't have access to a hospital with a maternity that's open. Maybe they're told they can't birth there because there may or may not be enough midwife on the day. Maybe they're not getting adequate maternity or, respectful maternity care. I've heard that. I've heard of people that are just not getting respectful maternity care. And that's the only hospital that they have access to. So if they're not feeling respected, if they're feeling bullied, if they're feeling like they're being shut down, they're not being heard, and that's early in their pregnancy, well, I can totally understand that they don't want to birth there. Like, you don't want to be in a vulnerable state that birth is, having to fight against people, against, obstetricians or midwives, to have your voice heard and to be listened to. And, and that's one consideration. The other consideration is, well, what if you don't have a hospital nearby? What if you don't have a private midwife nearby? I'm not trying to justify women free birthing, but I'm trying to add to the conversation and say, well, there is a deeper issue. And I know that you can't solve that problem by just building a hospital. It's not that simple. But also, free birth happens because of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of maternity open. We know that the maternity in Gladstone was closed just a few years ago in Queensland, and people had to drive. People that lived in Gladstone had to drive from Gladstone to Rockhampton to birth. The Gladstone Hospital has actually reopened. So back in 2022, in about July-ish 2022, the Gladstone maternity was actually put on bypass, which meant that women that wanted to birth in a hospital that wanted to birth in Gladstone Hospital were actually turned away, and they were told that they couldn't birth there. And so the nearest birthing hospital from Gladstone is actually Rockhampton, which is more than an hour away on not so, gentle roads as well. And not practical. And so there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of protest because Gladstone is quite a populated area. And now I've actually read that the Gladstone maternity is back on. It's reopened, and they've, the Queensland Health has tried to cover vacancies and so on. It took so much protest. It was on bypass for more than a year. That's more than a year where any birthing woman in Gladstone had no choice but to go to Rockhampton. See, and that's just one example that I found because I knew of it. When we talk about, free birth is on the rise, or, women are free birthing, they're irresponsible, they're taking a lot of risks. Well, sometimes women don't have a choice because they don't have infrastructure available to them. They just don't have a maternity open to give birth in, right? So, I mean, that's something that's not spoken about in the article. So let's, again, adding nuance to this, right? And lastly, the last thing I want to talk about in this is, to me, even though it was clearly stated that, this article wasn't a witch hunt and it wasn't trying to point the finger at anyone, to me, it clearly was a witch hunt. And I think, to me, when I first heard of the ABC doing an investigation to free birth, what really stood out to me is, why are they doing an investigation on free birth? And so, this is what Charlotte Kings covers and so on. And she talks about how it came to be. Fair enough. Maybe it came out of a point of interest, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But what's really interesting is if we consider the agenda that, for example, the ABC has, to me, in their article, what they're really trying to show is that the doula industry is unregulated, which it is. That's true. But is there, to me, I'm asking the question today, is there a deeper agenda of maybe the ABC trying to, maybe they're working with someone else? I'm not sure. I'm just putting guesses out there. I'm putting speculations out there. Are they working with someone else to try and get the industry regulated? Because, well, for example, private midwives are a regulated industry. They have to answer to the Australian College of Midwives. True. As an exercise physiologist, I am part of a regulated industry as well. I have to respond to a governing body. True. Is there a bit of, I don't want to say jealousy because that sounds like a sibling thing, right? Is there a bit of jealousy type thing where, because doulas are unregulated but midwives are a regulated unregulated industry, there's a bit of bickering there of going, well, you're advertising for your services and you're unregulated, but midwives are also advertising for their services, but they're regulated, but they obviously have to answer to more, they also, midwives, private midwives, they have to follow guidelines and protocols. They might have a bit more leeway in their guidelines and protocols, but at the end of the day, they do have protocols and guidelines that they're abiding by. They're not just freely providing what they believe is the best point of care. They're providing what the best point of care is according to guidelines as defined by the Australian College of Midwives. So, I mean, I'm putting the question out there. Is there a deeper meaning to this? Is there an agenda that someone is trying to push? Is there something bigger coming where there might be some form of regulation coming for doulas? Is that a thing? Is that something that might happen? I'm not sure. I'm putting it out there. Share your thoughts, please. Let me know. Was I the only one that thought that maybe this was actually the start of something bigger happening in the doula industry? But yeah, I thought it was funny that a private midwife mentioned that, doulas can freely advertise, I'm putting quotation marks there, about their, free birthing services. And, I don't know if she was intending to say that, well, that's basically pushing women more towards a free birth because they're seeing that there's birth keepers or doulas, that have free birthing services, which to me, that's totally wrong, because if a woman wants to free birth and she wants to find a doula, well, she will. But to me, a woman will not be influenced by seeing a doula advertising their services and go, oh, I'm going to have a free birth now. Usually a woman has decided free birth and then she searches for a doula. She didn't decide to have a free birth because she saw a doula advertising their free birth services. To me, that's how it happens. Prove me wrong, please, if I'm wrong. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And also we know that private midwives freely advertise their services too. They freely advertise that they offer private midwifery services. Isn't it the same then? Obviously one industry is regulated, the other one isn't. They're both advertising their services freely for women who are seeking that option, are wanting to explore that option. Where's the harm in that? So anyway, I think I'll conclude this episode here. I hope this made you think about something. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. Thank you so much for listening. I know this is a little bit of, this is really different to what I usually do, but I thought it would be quite interesting to add a bit of arguments to the conversation and just see it in a different light, which is what I like to do. So hopefully you got something out of it. Please feel free to share this. I really want to help as many women as I can. I do this out of absolute passion for women to have a choice to birth however they want. This is not a witch hunt. My talk is not a witch hunt. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just adding nuance to the conversation. I love that women have a choice of, they have the power to decide what feels right for them. If I can help to convey some ideas, then, I love that. So feel free to share this. Feel free to, spread the word out there. Cuppa with a doula. I love talking about birth. I love hearing women talk about their birth, regardless of where and how they birth. I love it. I am always looking for birth stories. So if you want to share your birth stories, please get in touch with me. Cuppa with a doula on Facebook and Instagram. You can send me a direct message and I'll respond to you. I respond to all my DMs. So thank you so much for listening today. And I hope this was informative and helpful. And I will see you next week with a brand new episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to get notified of when a new episode comes out, please subscribe to this show on your podcast listening platform. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast or share this episode so that other moms can find it. If you would like to tell your own pregnancy, birth, or parenting story, please head to the show notes and you will find a form there to get in touch with me. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I will be with you again next week for a new episode.